Welcome to A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk into a Bar.
The podcast where we mix a sometimes weird but always delicious cocktail of theology, philosophy, and spirituality.
This episode is one that I was really looking forward to. I've been looking forward to since I read this book. The book is Shoutin' in the Fire, an American Epistle by Danté Stewart, and this book moved me. This book captivated me. It brought me into his world. He is a brilliant, beautiful writer. He's a poet, and it also ruined me. I mean, it affected me. I'm still feeling the effects of it in the best ways. So I couldn't wait to speak to Danté, and he did not disappoint.
So we've decided that a fun thing to do on the podcast will be to start reading reviews that we've received.
It's going to be fun.
Yeah, mostly from Apple reviews. That's where most of them are. If you haven't yet, go to Apple Podcasts or iTunes, leave us a positive review. Facebook is another place you can leave reviews. So we're gonna start reading those. So here's one. So this is from Baron von Yolo 44.
Baron.
I already like
My
it.
man.
And they say, more questions than answers on this podcast, and I love it. I feel like I've been given permission by a preacher and a smart guy, hey, I like this guy already, to not have it figured out. The booze tastings in the beginning are surprisingly influential. Skip that part if you're on a tight budget.
Baron von Yolo, thanks for the review, and friends, we'd love to read yours sometime soon. And speaking of something that we do around here, we also shout out a Patreon supporter. We couldn't exist and couldn't get better and better without you Patreon supporters. And so today we just want to shout out a top shelf supporter, Joseph Steinke, the man, the myth, the legend. Joe, thank you for supporting the show. Cheers.
Cheers.
So for the tasting today, we get yet another week of enjoying Kyle's ridiculous, luxurious, just absolutely absurd collection of liquor and beer, and we get to benefit from it. So cheers to Kyle's, absurd collection. But he brought some Glenmorangie. Or
you want to try it again?
Glenmorangie. Let's have proud Scot Brian Cox tell us how to pronounce Glenmorangie.
Glenmorangie.
As YouTube
that was wonderful.
Just prior to our episode.
That was wonderful.
Okay, so tell us about this, Kyle.
So this is Glenmorangie. That's all how I've always said it, and I think
of course
Brian
you were
Cox
right.
Just justified me. So the first scotch I ever had was a Glenmorangie scotch. I knew I was going to like it. I had just a little bit of whiskey, like Jack Daniels level shit, and could tell enough that if there's like a good version of this, I'm going to be really into it. But I also had this, I don't know if my family had some Scottish ancestry or what, but I've always just kind of been into Scotland. My dad has too. And so I wanted my first scotch to be special. And so I did a bunch of research and I got on a bunch of forums and people recommending what they thought a good first scotch would be. And what I settled on was Glenmorangie 10. And I'm glad I did. It's a Highland. This? No, okay. This is a little more special than that. But if anybody's never had scotch before, has a kind of a taste for whiskey, wants to get into scotch, that's a good one to go with because it's easily available, it's affordable, and it's a really excellent, balanced expression that'll give you a little bit of all the good stuff and none of the stuff that you kind of have to acquire a taste for. So I loved Glenmorangie, and then my wife and I vacationed or honeymooned, part of our honeymoon in Scotland, and literally our time in Scotland was planned according to where the distilleries were.
Everybody knows Kyle.
So we spent a night in a really awesome Airbnb, or actually it wasn't an Airbnb, it was an actual B&B.
Nice.
Really close to Glenmorangie. And it's one of the fancier distilleries we visited. It's kind of out in the rural area, and they have this, I don't know if you can see it on the bottle, it's like a signet that's on everything they do. That's kind of plastered everywhere at their distillery. There's a lot of money there. It feels like, But they're really good at finishing their stuff in a lot of interesting casks. They do a lot of sherry. They do a lot of wine barrels. They obviously do bourbon barrels. This one's port.
Oh, fun.
So this is finished.
That's why I'm getting
a port pipe.
It says matured in bourbon casks, then extra matured in port casks.
Yeah,
so we're getting both.
So the standard for all scotch is ex-bourbon casks, and then sometimes finished in other things. And Glenmorangie just has a really excellent finishing program. So this is a 12-year-old non-chill filtered port cask finish scotch. It's called Quinta Ruban.
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited that you said it's finished in port casks because I'm smelling this, and the nose is not just like straight up smoke and peaty. It's dark fruit, and it's autumnal, and it smells hot to me.
Yeah, I don't think it is on the palate so much. It's 46%.
Okay, wow,
Shouldn't be much, if any, peat.
so
in
much
this.
going on.
No, I
There's-
wouldn't call peatiness out at all.
I would. I mean, I taste the peatiness, but it's not like the crazy. That's all you can taste. Like there is that dark fruit, rich. There's not a ton of smokiness to it. It's sweet, but there's just it's complex as hell. Like it's really good.
So apparently Quinta is Portuguese for wine estates. If anybody cares.
Somebody who's listening cares, Kyle.
That's really good. Yeah, the dark fruit, and then it smells more like orange than it tastes like orange. But
No, I get that.
No, yeah, like caramelized almost. This is one of the better. I won't say one of the better scotches because I don't know what a better scotch is. This is one of my favorite scotches I've ever had.
Oh, nice.
It's very good.
Yeah, they have a lot of really excellent, interesting finished stuff.
I would say I want this with the fire and a cigar in fall weather, but at the same time, I want this before or after the cigar because the cigar is going to
yeah, right.
blast my
Yeah.
palate, and I'm not going to be able to pick up on this good stuff. This is delightful.
Yeah,
This
this
really
is a little bit. I thought of this one actually when we had the Basil Hayden Dark Rye because it had actual
Yeah.
port in it.
Yeah.
This one obviously is not quite as in your face with the port, but
adjunct,
has a
if you will.
similar desserty profile.
Yeah. No, this is.
Yeah, very smooth and sweet, complex.
Yep.
All the best things.
Well, thank you for the treat, Kyle.
Of course.
What's it called again?
Quinta Ruban from Glenmorangie.
Glenmorangie. Cheers. Cheers. So Danté Stewart, welcome to A Pastor and Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.
Hey, what's up? What up? What up?
Just tell us a bit about who is Danté Stewart?
Whew. I mean, I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a minister. I'm a writer. I live in Augusta, Georgia. I was raised in the Black rural South and in between Swansea, South Carolina, St. Matthews, South Carolina, and Sandy Run, South Carolina. I did my schooling at Clemson, did my undergraduate there where I met my wife, played football as well. And now my wife, she's actually in the Air Force, and we're stationed in Augusta, Georgia, or whatnot, where I'm on staff at the historic Tabernacle Baptist Church. And I'm a student at Emory University at the Campbell School of Theology. So, yeah, and I love to read a lot of books, and I love to write. I absolutely adore writing. There's nothing, like Jason Reynolds said, there's nothing like the feeling of completion and just that feeling you get when you write something, you think it up, you dream it up, you imagine it, and you get it completed. So that's me. That's me.
Yeah. So Danté, I had this experience when I picked up your book and I started reading the introduction. It was similar to this experience. Now, this is a high level comparison here, but I remember where I was the first time I read East of Eden by Steinbeck. And I remember where I was because I was so arrested by the beauty in the prose in his writing. I was just like, this guy writes like nobody else I've read. And I had a similar experience when I picked up your book and read your introduction, and you brought us into your world in South Carolina, and I could smell the smells and I could taste the things, and you had me in that introduction, and I was like, oh shit, I'm having an East of Eden moment. Like, this guy is a real writer. You know, like we talk to thinkers, we talk to people who write things, but they write things because they know about them a lot. You wrote about something that you firsthand experienced in your life, but at the same time, you, my friend, are a poet. Like, I was stunned.
Thank you.
Yeah, in the book, in chapter 1, you dive right in. You bring us through your childhood and your youth in Southern Black Pentecostal culture in rich ways, in ways that, like, I can smell the fried livers and hot sauce in the air, you know what I mean? And then you bring us into this spiritual transition that you went through where you're listening to sermons by guys like John Piper and John MacArthur, which, jeez, oh my, I want to.
I was deep in there, bro. I was in there, bro. I was deep. I was deep in it.
So, and then eventually you tell the story of getting baptized, rebaptized, and telling your mom about you getting rebaptized. And it sounded to me like you were writing about getting baptized into whiteness. Tell us about that transition and like how you got to getting baptized in that white evangelical reformed church.
Yeah. And what's crazy is actually, that particular church wasn't Reformed, but it was a white evangelical church. It was actually a Calvary Chapel.
Okay.
Or whatnot. So associated with the kind of California movement of I think it was like the 70s or 80s or whatnot when it came into being with the people who called themselves the Jesus movement or whatnot. And what's crazy is, so much of my story began, like so many of our stories, young black people on college campuses. And as readers who read, and you saw, the longer I was on Clemson University campus, the further I moved away from, my own upbringing, because just like the military or football, there's a sort of re-education process. So like when you go to basic training, as much as we're simply talking about, you're getting trained in military doctrine and practice and things like that. In a very real way, you're being re-educated as a person, and this institution wants you to become a certain type of person once you leave, for good or for ill. Every environment, whether that be political, whether that be social, whether that be militaristic, whether that be business, civic, whatever, that institution has a certain type of values and practices and principles and philosophies and things of that nature, and rhythms that are integral to the institution's own self-conception of itself and what it wants to prioritize and what it wants to be like in the world. And it has its ideas of what type of people it wants to be there. And just so happened that, being on Clemson University's campus, oftentimes being in white social space, which Clemson University is, and I would deem, many churches, many business, civic institutions and things like that, social groups, are white social space. And that space comes with a certain type of buy-in. So either through assimilation or through silence, many of us young black people, because so many of our elders back home have this given, this kind of unwritten message of, in order for me to make it, means that I have to be in closer proximity to white people. So we something simple as football, recruiting, that when, as many of us were, are good at football, and you start talking about recruiting, the HBCU does not represent the creme de la creme of where, to use the popular phrase, we want to go take our talents, and so this white social space becomes like, God in a sense. So this message we learn over time through our investment in that space, because of its access, because of its aesthetics, because of its rewards and things like that. What we believe is that these institutions are to be deemed sacred, worthy of our ultimate devotion, worthy of the best that we have to offer. And many of the places that we come from are to be deemed with suspicion, as I write about with the cop, in college, saw me through the lens of suspicion. And oftentimes that's the story that's so bound up into these institutions, where I write, this is the script that was already written. We're just performers in that story oftentimes. In ways that we often don't really understand, are not even aware of, because sometimes we're not on that wavelength. We're not in that mindset. We're not using that framework. But yeah, I think the further I got into that space, the more deeper I got invested in whiteness. And many of those spaces wouldn't believe themselves to be white. But when you think about who benefits in these spaces, and who can we survive, whose presence we can survive without and thrive without, then you'll understand that at the center of both of those questions is what Eddie Glaude calls the value gap. White people are valued more. And then this ideology has risen to the level of religion that tells us the message that to be closer to whiteness is to be closer to God. Yep. To be closer to whiteness is to be closer to success. To be closer to whiteness is to be closer to beauty, or to whatever we desire for ourselves. And I think that section, particularly talking about being baptized, that pretty much was the crescendo of kind of my acceptance and assimilation into that way of thinking and that way of being in the world that so many young black people fall victim to.
Is it 100% that if you as a black man try to enter this white world and you get baptized into that whiteness and you find acceptance in the white world, is it pretty much a given that you're going to lose part of who you are in your blackness?
That's a tough question, but I do think in some sense that to exist in this white space, there is always, as I write about in Wages, there's always a cost and there's always a price to pay. Mm-hmm. And I think when we're talking about giving up things, that to exist in white spaces, those who give up most are those who care for least. Mm. And I will say that exists in that space, we have to give up so much of ourselves, mm-hmm. whether that be thinking about athletes, and what I write about with Trayvon Martin and what happened that, for me, the cost was too great for me to stand in solidarity with my teammates, in solidarity with Trayvon, because I felt like, I was standing on fragile ground. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, especially when you're talking about, when you're talking about racial dynamics, and in some sense, gender and sexuality dynamics, whenever we feel like our existence is on fragile ground, we're always going to bargain our humanity to those who have the most power. Mm-hmm. It's like many progressive movements in history. Oftentimes, they fall prey to those who make decisions within those movements, having to bargain the humanity of others in order to function. Sadly, that's kind of the struggle in politics, is that oftentimes the bargain is most times with white people benefiting in mind, mm-hmm. and things like that. And so I would say, to be invested in white social spaces is fundamentally to give up a certain part of yourself. But I do know that we have to live in the tension and the nuance of being. And we have to say that if one exists in white space, that doesn't mean that responding to whiteness is the totality of our being. As mm-hmm. if like to simply go to Clemson and to be black is to be fundamentally concerned with what white people think. That's just not the case. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There would be moments where, you're forced to think about that in ways that are more pressing than others. But I will say that to exist in that space, there is always a cost and a price to pay. And that cost, in some sense, seems to always be racialized, mm-hmm. and benefit white people most. And you think about conversation about reconciliation, it's always, when you talk about unity and reconciliation, it's not many times, especially Christian conversation on reconciliation and unity, it's not really taken into account with the liberation and the humanity of the marginalized, but oftentimes the comfort, mm-hmm. And the mm-hmm. progress of the powerful. Yep. And I think this is also true with being black and white in white spaces. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why I wrote my book is if somebody is black in a white space, which I'm sure many readers will be, and I would say to be in this country and to exist will mean you have to be tied to white space because, the power dynamics in this country. Now, hopefully by the time people finish my book, they will embrace what it means to be black more. Mm-hmm. And when white people read this, white people will stop making black life about white education or about white terror, that we would be allowed to exist as human beings, ordinarily powerful and beautiful in and of ourselves and worthy of love and liberation and the fullness of our being, in ways that we don't have to bargain.
Seriously. Last year, Danté, as George Floyd was murdered right in our faces, and we go through a summer of upheaval and protests and beautiful noise, and then my church literally did this day of repentance and solidarity for the white church, and the same day we had this event with black churches and white churches coming together, Jacob Blake is shot just 20 miles south of us 7 times in the back by a police officer, and I processed with a black man who's part of our church in the weeks after that, and he was just struggling so much with hatred. He wanted a white police officer to be shot and killed so that the white community could feel in that pain, right? Like, because it was just felt so personal for him. Yeah. In chapter 2, you talk about your conversations with your dad and your desire to talk about his experience as a black man in Dillard, South Carolina, and you quote him by saying, "It takes everything not to hate white people." This is your dad who didn't share a whole lot about his experience as a black man. Can you tell us about what you felt in him saying that and what must be this constant battle not to give in to bitterness and hatred towards white people?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer that, I don't know how to answer, in some sense. Like, you got to realize my daddy is a baby of the 50s. Mm-hmm. And my daddy grew up in Jim Crow South, The stories that my daddy tell me is incredibly visceral. And in some sense, like, I'm even trying to formulate how I think about hatred, and like, how are we to respond to a world that allows people to terrorize us with impunity?
Yeah.
And given that dynamic, is it really hatred? Is it really characterized as hatred? Or is it characterized as, one's profound belief in your humanity, so much so that you refuse to allow people to terrorize you in impunity, and you refuse to allow your ideals of them to be neutral? So, like, there's a way to think about whiteness and white people as if, like, every single white person in this country is neutral, but that's not the case. And so, given that dynamic of the non-neutrality of whiteness, how can we reformulate how we think about concepts of hatred in a moral framework? Now, I'm kind of talking kind of heady real quick.
It's good.
Because I'm even thinking about this right now because, my dad has a right to hate white people. We have a right to hate white people because white people have done terrible things to us and have done terrible things to the world. There's a familiar colloquialism that everybody has done terrible things, and that's very true. But there's a particular way that whiteness has functioned within the world that has been particularly terrible to the earth and to the inhabitants of the earth. And we got to be honest about that. And we have to say, you have to make room for the tension of living with those whom the country believes should just get over everything and just forget as if like they're not alive. Because in reality today, so many people in this country are acting. So I'm 29 years old. My grandmama's still alive. My granddaddy's still alive. My daddy and my mama still alive. People, great-grandmas and great-granddaddies still alive. And it's as if people are asking them not to exist. Like, it's as if people are asking them to get rid of their memories.
Yeah.
And they saw all of this, and they experienced all of this, and their children have to experience all of this. And you tell them that they're not to hate those people in that situation. Seems a bit cruel, in a sense. But also I can understand, especially given, the religious and moral framework of hate and love that we are so used to, that many of us don't have room for living in that tension. But I personally want to make room for that tension while also realizing that my daddy did not become what he saw in others, nor did many black people become what they saw in others. But for those who did, they had a right to do that. So Nat Turner had a right to do that. Demar Vesey had a right to do that. And I want to hold that intention. I don't want to be the type of Christian that says, hey, love and forgiveness become a way to allow people to destroy you with impunity without any accountability here or in heaven. It's like you want justice in heaven while we have to deal with terror on earth. And I just think we need to do better, at making tension for that, which is why I personally wanted to wrestle with the idea of rage, as a spiritual virtue, and it allowing one to live in the tension of being while not losing an idea to hold the capacity for another person's humanity within my own living, and I think that's the only way we can understand, how we are to survive and to love and to imagine. And in some sense, like I said earlier, my dad's living was not simply focused on what white people did. He had to get up and provide for his family. He had to live. He had to go to church. He had to do this, to do that. His capacity of being and being alive was about the life he built for himself and for his family. And I think whatever ideas of hatred would mean, he did not become whatever that was. Because in some sense, the question really is, why do white people hate black people so much?
Yes.
That's the real question. Someone should walk away from is not my daddy's ability to hold that intention, but the question one should really ask is, why have white people not have, as Baldwin would say, the capacity to love?
I want to ask about a couple of concepts that you've mentioned and just go a little more deeply into them. Unity and also rage, and I think these are maybe connected to what you were just talking about. So you tell a story of preaching a sermon in this white church that you were in 2016, and this was just a couple months after Alton Sterling was murdered. And you said you chose the topic of unity, and I guess at the time you were still what Randy described as being baptized into this white culture.
Yep.
And you say, I believed that a message on unity was what we needed to help me feel human, white people less racist, the church more equal, and the country more loving. And you write with regret about that sermon. I know a lot of Christians who currently think that way. Not so long ago, I thought that way. And I still get like warm fuzzies in my stomach when I read Jesus talking about unity in his last prayer before ascending into heaven. You know what I mean? So unity is important, and it's part of the DNA of being a Christian, I would argue. And yet there's also something obviously off about a white church only wanting to hear about race relations in the context of unity. So what do you say to people now who think unity is the answer to racial tension?
Yeah, I really want to cite this black sister, and her name is slipping me. She said, unity is good, but freedom is better.
Yeah. Yep.
That's probably the best way to think about that. Unity is good, but freedom is better.
There it is.
And now 4-5 years removed from that moment, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that whatever conceptions of unity people had is not powerful enough to change a person's ability or inability to see you as human. I used to think that proximity would make people more loving.
Yeah.
I used to think that simply being close to people, being nice, saying the right words, preaching the right things, and things like that will make people do better and become better. But in some sense, I feel like many times our presence became an excuse and even in some sense a weapon. Our very presence became weaponized in ways that allowed people to talk about race in life while also evading them.
Yeah.
Because their ideas of proximity never wanted to talk about power. And I'll never forget reading Stokely Carmichael's quote where he says that racism is not about attitudes. He said, I don't care if a white man don't like me, but I do care that a white man has the ability to lynch me.
Mm-hmm.
And Martin Luther King riffed off to that, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King riffed off that and say, laws may not change the heart, but laws can keep someone from lynching me.
Yep.
And what both of them are talking about, both in the legal dimensions from Martin Luther King or from the political dimensions or philosophical dimensions from Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Tumbre, is really they're talking about power dynamics. Kwame Tumbre says, it's not about attitudes, but it's about power. And I think so much of our ideas about unity and reconciliation do not want to deal with power, because to talk about power, I think one has to critically examine the ways in which our theologies and our traditions have given justification, moral, political, and theological justification for the inequities of power and the asymmetries of power, and the ways in which we have given a given system of injustice that people have to live in, whether it be race, gendered, or regarding sexuality, or regarding class. We have oftentimes given moral and theological justification for that. And so to think about Jesus in John 17 and that prayer, oftentimes, think about this reality that, like, when I wrestle with that text, that Jesus prays for us, but he does not protect us.
Explain that.
He prays for us that we be unified, but he does not protect us from bad religion. He does not protect us from toxic theologies. He does not protect us from people who, as Howard Thurman would say, who use Christianity to become the religion of the powerful in ways that was not in the mind of Jesus. Jesus prays for us and he gives us a framework, but Jesus does not protect us from bad religion and toxic theology. That's our job. You know, that's our side of it, is to try and develop communities and institutions and ways of being together that will become more loving and more just and more equitable, and take into account as the feminists would talk about, the standpoints in which we understand the world, the ways in which we enter the world as embodied persons, the ways, as Toni Morrison would say, the ways we flesh, and the ways in which, in this kind of system of fleshing and being alive, yonder, wherever yonder is, whether you're race, gender, sexuality, class, or immigration, or things like that, whatever these dynamics are, wherever yonder is, they don't love your flesh, but you have to love it. And so how do we think about power dynamics and creating a way of being together where people don't have to be reminded to love themselves, to embrace themselves, because they're in a situation where they are not loved? How can we create an environment where they don't have to be reminded?
Yeah.
But that is the given. And I think in so many conversations regarding unity and things like that, you know, I don't think people are reading enough, maybe. You know, we need better frameworks, especially as Christians. We need to read better books. We need to be listening better to different traditions and different ways of thinking and ways, I guess, epistemologies. We need better epistemic frameworks to help us understand what ails us. And so, you know, when I think about that sermon, when I think back then, I really do look on it with regret because of the ways in which my presence oftentimes gets weaponized, and the ways that I saw that happen, the ways I benefited from that happening, and the ways that I even exploited it and made it happen and did it to others.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, you know, this is what tends to happen. And I think for many young black people, particularly, I'm thinking particularly about black men in these spaces. Oftentimes as black men, we kind of, you know, as they say, drink the Kool-Aid. You know, we become what other people want to see in us without really taking into account whom it harms in the process.
Yeah. You said, you know, we need to read more and read better. Can you give us 5 authors that our listeners need to just write down and make sure they read in the next 6 months? Give us 5 authors.
Yeah, oh man, that's easy. Too easy. Robert Jones Jr.
Okay.
Read the Prophets. Deisha Phil, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. Read Kiese Layman, Heavy. Read Jason Reynolds. And read Jasmine Ward.
Okay.
This is for like literature.
Yep.
And of course, read the classes in Black Lit, but I do think that these 5 are doing such brilliant thinking today. So yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's my 5 off the top of my head.
Friends, before we continue, we want to thank Storyhill BKC for their support. Storyhill BKC is a full menu restaurant, and their food is seriously some of the best in Milwaukee. On top of that, Storyhill BKC is a full-service liquor store featuring growlers of tap available to go, spirits, especially whiskeys and bourbons, thoughtfully curated regional craft beers, and 375 selections of wine. Visit StoryhillBKC.com for menu and more info. If you're in Milwaukee, you'll thank yourself for visiting Storyhill BKC, and if you're not, remember to support local. One more time, that's StoryhillBKC.com.
You write about, as you put it earlier, the virtues of black rage and seeing rage as a spiritual virtue. I've seen this in other authors before, particularly people of color. I think you probably quote from some of them. This makes, as you put it, nice white Christians super uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Part of this inability to kind of examine the power dynamics you were talking about in white spaces means that even talking positively about anger, particularly in the context of race, pretty dangerous in white spaces, much less actually being angry in those spaces. And let's admit that there's a long Christian tradition, some of it in the Bible, of warnings against anger, warnings against wrath, and so forth. I'm not saying that's the whole of the testimony of the scripture, but it's in there. So what does it mean to say that, as you put it, my black rage in an anti-black world is a spiritual virtue? And how are rage and love connected?
Yeah. So like, you know, a lot of my thinking on that kind of grew out of reading James Cone, and I'll never forget reading Said I Wasn't Gonna Tell Nobody last year for the first time ever, which was his autobiographical kind of memoir text, The Making of a Black Theologian. And I'll never forget him writing about, the Detroit uprising and how he said, I had a PhD in theology, but I had nothing to offer my people.
Man.
And I need to figure out how to take what I had, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, and make it accountable both to God and to Black people. And as I read that section in those early chapters of the book, I could feel the seething anger that Cone wrote with. So yeah, man, as I was reading Cone, I wanted to figure out a way. It was a selfish question in some sense of, based on what I was reading, I wanted a way to figure out how, what to do with my anger in some sense, but not like I was tired of how triumphant Christians thought about anger, and even Black Christians, the ways Black Christians wrote about anger, almost as if both communities believe that love is absence of anger or rage or whatever kind of visceral reaction we have to injustice. I was tired of as if everything had to crescendo into forgiveness.
Yeah.
Every act of injustice had to have a happy ending where everything was okay in a sense, even if it's not okay. And out of my reading of Cone, it really sent me to read Nehemiah, and I deal with the biblical text as you do. And in my studies of the biblical text of the Hebrew Bible and Nehemiah's story, I was very struck by Nehemiah chapter 5, where when they came back and they come to repair the walls, and he sees the situation in which people who looked like him, were treated as second-class citizens, as Charles Mills, God rest his soul, who just passed on not so long ago, who talked about in his Tanner lecture, 3 things kind of are markers of racialization or colonialism. It's second-class citizenship for the colonized, exploitation of their labor and their bodies and their creativity and their humanity, and continual disrespect of who they are and what they offer to the world. As I thought about, Nehemiah through that framework that Charles Mill opened up, Nehemiah was dealing with a similar reality where people who looked like him was treated as second-class citizens, where they were exploited, and they were in a system that continually disrespected them. And then when he saw the injustice, as chapter 5 would write, he thought about it and was angry. And then he brought charges against the officials. And I wanted to play with the idea theologically and ask the question, what would it mean to write about rage that was not bound to the white imagination of rage? So if you think about, if we were to ask the honest question, how many times, name events where Black people or indigenous people or Hispanics or anybody who's non-white per se, in mass, did something violent and destructive whereby which there was loss of life, property, power, and place toward white people. That's a hard historical task. That's a tall order. Now, if we reverse the question and ask to name that in which white people did that against others, that's not a tall task. It's a very easy task. And because it's such an easy task, that in some sense shapes the imagination of what we mean by violence, what we mean by rage, what we mean by suffering in so many ways, because that visceral experience of historical narratives that we are so shaped by. And so oftentimes when we simply say the language rage, in some sense, people think they are talking about non-white people when in actuality, they are actually thinking about what white people have done and what we can become. So that's why, it's always the language of you don't want to become what you hate to see in others. Okay, what is it that you hate to see in others that so people are fearful of you becoming? And how can you name that? And what the story does that naming that reality tell, about what has happened in our country and what has happened to so many people. And so for me, I didn't want to give white religion, white theology, white people the ability to have a monopoly on the language of rage, on the language of anger, on the language of resistance and protest and things like that, either for good or for bad, whether one is criticizing it or whether one is embodying it. And oftentimes being black and angry has been used as a trope and a stereotype, which I wanted to ask the question, as Elizabeth Alexander in her incredible book, The Black Interior, asks, what would it mean to look again? Mm-hmm. And what I wanted to do is look again at what it means to be black and angry, and allow us to tell that story, allow me to tell that story in ways that look like Nehemiah and thought like Nehemiah and examine the world like Nehemiah and held in tension, what it means to be enraged at a situation while not losing your humanity or the humanity of others in the process. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, y'all really got me thinking about a lot because, as a writer, for the last year and some change, I've been in the text as a writer. Now I'm shifting to thinking critically about my own text. As a reader of my own text, as a rereader of my own text, as a thinker, and there's so many questions, that I haven't even thought about and even thinking about and trying to formulate. In my own mind, but that's the part of the process too. Mm-hmm. So it's part of the growth and learning.
You in your book bring us into the sensual world that you grew up in, that you lived in, and I'm a foodie. So as soon as you started talking about smells and flavors and cooking, I'm there. When you think of like your favorite meal that you're gonna go home to your grandma and granddaddy and you're gonna have that quintessential meal from family, what is it?
Pig feet and rice, bro.
Okay.
Pig feet and rice with the pig feet gravy on the rice with some collard greens.
So, and that pig feet gravy has been going for hours, right?
Oh yeah, that's it right there. New Year's Eve, bro. Every New Year's Eve, one time a year.
Man, all right.
Gotta look out for your pressure now.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, man. That pig feet and rice really reminds me of back home, and it reminds me so much of like, the ways in which food and the process of food and the earth and the land and the new year, and the prayers, like so much of food and culture in general, especially if we think about cultural studies, in the ways in which anthropologists or philosophers or theorists, sociologists think about the relationship between people and their culture. Food is very much, a public cultural artifact. It is very much public history. How people think about the land and the earth, what people make with their hands, how they build life. Food is so much a part of that. Yep. And it's a really brilliant documentary that I hope it's still up on Netflix, High on the Hog. If people get a chance to look at High on the Hog, it's a beautiful, beautiful documentary about black people and food. And like that quintessential meal, bro, is the pig feet and rice, and it just reminds me of so much that I love about back home. But like when you eat that pig feet and rice, but y'all chilling, like you ain't moving. Like, it's sticky and messy, so it's a very delicate thing. You gotta really,
you're up in there.
You gotta sit and eat. You gotta sit and eat with everybody. And I'm a cooker too, so
good.
So much of what I learned back home, I can still cook today whenever I have guests, and so we can still, wherever we go. I'll never forget going to Cali. When we were stationed out there, I did Thanksgiving dinner for everybody, and people got a taste of the South, and they never had food from the South. They thought it was the best thing ever. I knew it wasn't, just because I can't cook like my mom. Yeah, I knew I can't cook like my mom and grandma, but I mean, it was decent, it was good, but there's something about Southern food, and Southern ways of doing food that I would even say is sacred in some sense.
Yep. Amen. One heavy question, because there's a chapter in your book, Pieces, and Pieces was just brutal for me. I mean, like, it affected me in some visceral ways where I just read through Pieces and I just felt this lead weight on my chest. And you talking about the hopelessness in the black experience in America and how basically you say white people destroyed hope and optimism in you. Can you just, and I feel bad for even asking, for asking you to recount this this experience of hopelessness in blackness. But can you just give us some words for our listeners to understand, to bring them into that experience?
First of all, I would think about it the way Imani Perry thinks about it in her essay for The Atlantic. Racism is bad, blackness is not. So when I speak of hopeness and blackness and race, I'm not, because the question becomes, are you giving white people, too much power, within your own story, your own kind of self-conception of hope. I can hear somebody saying, I can hear like a black Christian saying that or something like that. Are you giving white people too much power in what you think about hope? Or, have you conceived of definitions of hope that is rooted in slaveholder religion and things like that, in traditions of, thinking about hope that are bound to whiteness? And I would respond, I don't know, in a sense, because I don't think any of us can claim a certain type of purity, in any type of thought. But I will say that whatever people have thought about hope does not work for us. Whatever people have conceived of hope needs to be deconstructed, dismantled, and something better held out.
Wow.
Because I think for many people, hope is a theory or an abstract principle. It is a certain destination to be had and reached. So hope, much like conceptions of home in literature or in religion, represents a completion of the journey where all is well. Whether people think about heaven as a home, or people think about going back home, or people think about home when I leave, and things like that, oftentimes conceived of as an abstract principle that keeps one grounded in the midst of one's reality that is unpleasing and sometimes unpleasant. And I just kind of, I long gave up on that, because I think that conception of hope is often tied with ideas of unity, which are often tied to ideas of anti-blackness, white supremacy, that wants us to be hopeful, and hopeful in the sense of accepting the worst, as Kiese will write about, the worst of white folk. Just us accepting the worst of white folk and believing that, there's coming a day where all will be well. It's this familiar thing when, just like when Botham Jean was murdered, and that thing pissed me off to this day thinking about it. And thinking about his younger brother giving that white girl a hug.
Yeah. And
then years later, she appealing.
Come on.
And you, I'm trying to hold my tongue, but you're
don't bother.
Yeah. No, I'm just looking out for my mama if my mama listens to this. You tell me that your conception of hope, I'm speaking, when I say you, I'm just speaking in general, your conception of hope, can it hold intention? The reality of this is the world that we're living in. This is the world that we said, or we have inherited, that said is to come. But this is also the world that our ancestors died in and lived in and were buried in. And how do we make sense of that without being triumphal? And so as I write about, my hope is in the struggle.
Yeah.
My hope ain't in no principle. My hope ain't in no abstract place. It ain't. It just ain't. I ain't there. That ain't my thing no more, bruh. I just don't think that. I don't think in those terms anyway. And it's so funny, that people will listen to that and say oh man, you're hope for heaven. And I'm like, no. I people oftentimes talk about your best life is in. They criticize Joel Osteen, oftentimes saying your best life is not now, your best life is later. Nah, I want my best life now and my best life later.
Yeah.
And I believe that we deserve our best life now and our best lives later. And whenever we get wherever we at, let it be then. But right now, whatever I conceive of hope will be my capacity to tell the truth, be honest and vulnerable, and try and do something of love while standing in the world as who I am, in the fullness of that being, in the fullness of that life.
Yep.
trying to help us imagine something better, which Jesus called the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And in some sense, that the hope of the faith, the traditions of faith, is that somehow together we can hopefully we can make something better, than what we leave behind. And I think that's what Baldwin said at the end of his essay entitled In Search of a Majority. He says, I conceive of God, not as a means to control other, but as a means of liberation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And too oftentimes people think about God as a tool and a toy. But that's not God's way. And I think, as he concludes, he says, the world is before you. You need not take it or leave it as you found it. And I think if we're not going to take the world or leave the world as we found it, for me, that meant giving up those theoretical and theological conceptions of hope that were triumphalistic, that was reductive, that simply meant black people must always forgive, that just simply felt like sacredness was just simply bound to the Bible. So like for me now, like the same way those in the biblical text, the biblical narrative, can name their ancestors as sacred and their lives worthy of finding meaning in, i.e., books named after people, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and things like that, then I want to read the book of James Baldwin. I want to read the book of Toni Morrison. I want to read the book of Toni Cade Bambara. I want to read the book of Nella Larson and Jean Toomer. I want to read the book of June Jordan and Fanon and the likes, and Cone and Cannon and many more contemporary writers. I want to read the book of them and figure out how can I learn how to live, and as the Bible says, not let my living be in vain.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's my conception of hope.
So in the book of Danté Stewart, you open by talking about listening to your mom pray prayers at night, crying out to Jesus on your behalf, on your brothers and sisters' behalf. And now you have 2 kids. We just heard your son calling your name, right? And you have a 6-month-old daughter. What are your prayers now, as you're the one praying these prayers for your black son and daughter?
Yeah. I pray simply, man, health, life, strength. Something simple, bro. I pray that when they see me and Jazz, my wife, and they see how we move and maneuver in the world, that they see something commendable in us, that whenever they write about us, they have good stories, And when I mean good stories, I mean that they are able to tell human and honest stories of us, but stories of ways in which we've tried to get better and more loving and more mature and more responsible. I pray that, as they grow up and they see this house surrounded by books, that they realize that the world is open to them. There's no place in this. I mean, there are worlds surrounding me. It's almost like the multiverse.
Yeah.
There are multiverses. There are multitudes and multiverses in this room. And you have freedom to go wherever you want. And that's my prayer for them. They'll land where they need to land.
That's
just
good.
like I landed where I needed to land. My wife landed where she needed to land. I want to do better at helping my children soar in ways that I felt that I could have been helped better when I was coming through.
Yep. Yeah. Danté, do you know what your next book is yet?
Yeah.
Can you tell us? Can you tell us?
No, I can't tell you. But I will say I'm probably going to follow what many black writers have done, memoir essay collection. But I kind of like this memoir genre. I like that type of style of writing. I feel like
you're a storyteller.
Yeah, I'm a storyteller. So I feel like that's where I excel the most as a writer. Is give me some people, give me some books, and kind of let me go to work and let me think and let me write and let me wrestle, let me revise. And I feel like that's where I do my best work at. So I've been thinking a lot about book number 2. I kind of got a name and an outline. It's just I'm a more kind of a like I gotta be in it writer, and right now I'm not in a writing kind of book writing mode. I'm in essay writing mode and schoolwork. I'm not in book writing mode yet, but I think when I get there, it's gonna be special.
Yeah. Well, friends, the book is Shoutin' in the Fire, an American Epistle by Danté Stewart. And I want to tell you, I mean this every word, it is a must read. Everyone listening should buy this book and read it. Talk your way through it, process your way through it, come back and listen to this episode to connect dots. But it's an extremely important book, I think. Danté Stewart, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for having me.
So Danté mentioned a ton of books in that episode. We're going to link to some of them. It would be quite a chore to link to all of them, but the 5 that he mentioned for sure will be in the show notes. His book will also be in the show notes, and that's a special link if you want to support the podcast and you also want to buy the book, so you're supporting us both at the same time. Use that link. It'll take you to Amazon, buy the book. We'll get a kickback.
Thanks for listening to A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please rate and review the podcast before you close your app. You can also share the episode with friends or family members with the links from our social media pages. Gain inside access, extra perks, and more at patreon.com/apastorandafilosopher. We're so grateful for your support of the podcast. Until next time, this has been A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.